Just a few years ago, there was all of this talk about how there were way too many people on the planet. Humans are just too horny. We're pumping out too many babies. However, in more recent years, well, really just the past 3 or 4 years, there's now been a new trend to discuss how there just aren't enough babies being made, and how this is going to lead to a demographic crisis. Now we all know the dance of life. Humans are born, they live, and surprise, surprise, they die. And this happens to virtually every single human being drawing breath on this planet. It happens to every human being who has ever drawn breath on this planet, and most likely will continue to happen to humans in the future, save some revolutionary technology that pops up to make future humans immortal. Alas, this technology does not exist yet. And chances are, you and everyone you know and love will turn into worm food or ash at some point in the future. But the good news is that we can create by default. That means we can pass on our genetic material to the next generation, and then they can pass it on to the next generation and the following generation, and so on and so on and so forth. This is important since certain age brackets make up different contributions to a society and the economy at different stages of their lifetimes. As of today, my generation, the millennials, are in their peak contributing years. Well, almost there. Which is vastly different than what we were like during the 90s when most of us were shitting our diapers. But this video is not going to discuss the complex ways in which demographics work by an age-by-age basis, but rather the geography of demographics. Let's start off with the region that I happen to inhabit, an obscure part of the world by the name of North America, which by and large has some of the healthiest population dynamics. In sharp contrast to much of Europe and East Asia, the US and Canada by and large are slightly increasing their populations at fairly reasonable rates. This is by and large due to both countries' ability to attract high-skilled workers, oftentimes who want to settle down and gain permanent residency and then citizenship. These people are looking for better economic opportunities and political liberty and stability. As a result of large-scale migration, it is not a surprise that the vast majority of this population growth is stemming from ethnic and racial minorities. Nonetheless, there's still a rising population of Caucasian immigrants from Eastern Europe. For this reason, white people will eventually be a plurality rather than a majority of the United States by 2040. The highest population growth will come from Asians and Hispanics. Hispanics, in particular, have the highest birth rates, followed by African Americans, followed by Caucasian Americans. The African American population, by and large, will stay relatively static as a percentage of the total population, hovering around 12%. It is worth pointing out that many of these new immigrants are moving into the western and southern United States. These regions of the country have better weather, and by and large have more affordable housing and a lower cost of living than, say, New York City or Boston. However, there has been some controversy over the rapid rise of immigration, namely in regards to the affordability crisis in major cities. Many of these migrants are also more religious, and it's worth pointing out that religious people tend to have more children. The United States, by and large, is more religious than most developed nations. However, it has rapidly secularized in just the past 20 years, and is facing a similar trend that Europe was facing a decade ago. Nonetheless, this increased religiosity in comparison to Europe may explain some of the higher birth rates, as the more religious you are, the more babies you are likely to pump out, since the Bible literally says, "Be fruitful and multiply." Granted, with the affordability crisis and the increase in nativism, it is likely that both the US and Canada will face slower and slower birth rates due to relatively lower rates of immigration. Overall, however, the trajectory looks fairly positive, at least so far. Certainly a lot better than it does in Europe, China, and Japan. So let's move south of the Rio Grande, where you have Mexico. Mexico actually has a healthy demographic trend as well. If you look at a population pyramid, it almost kind of resembles an actual pyramid. It's already the third most populous nation in the Americas after the United States and Brazil, and has a burgeoning young population, which in the coming decades will become the economic driving force that will rapidly industrialize. The combination of a relatively low-skill workforce in Mexico, albeit one that is gaining more skills, with a high-skill workforce in the United States and Canada, will probably be a dynamic trio that ensures that North America stays one of the world's most premier economic powerhouses, save for some extreme forms of protectionism that kick in, which is a possibility. There will be some challenges. For example, much of the growth is concentrated in major cities, particularly in central Mexico. Mexico City, for example, is facing significant infrastructure pressures and ecological concerns. It is unlikely that many of these cities with very poor urban planning will be able to accommodate the rise in population growth. With that being said, there is room for more development elsewhere. And you don't see anywhere near the level of excess population growth that you see in, say, sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the rest of Latin America is a little bit more of a mixed bag, with some of the poor countries having somewhat higher population increases than some of the more wealthy ones. For example, richer Latin American nations like Argentina, Chile, and Costa Rica tend to have lower population growth than poorer ones like Bolivia or Peru. The most important country in Latin America, or at the very least the most important country in South America in terms of its actual size, would have to be the nation of Brazil, which was once the 5th largest country in the world, but at this point is probably 6th or 7th. Its population will be set to decline, in sharp contrast to, say, that of Canada or the United States. Brazil is not a major hotspot for global immigration anymore. It actually was during the first half to mid 20th century, but by and large, most people around the world want to immigrate to a country that by and large is more wealthy and stable than Brazil. Some people attribute this problem to the middle income trap. Brazil isn't actually poor by global standards, it's fairly well off. However, it's not well off enough to attract large-scale, high-skilled immigration. On top of that, women entering the workforce and a more urbanized, industrialized, or post-industrialized economy has led to many people in Brazil having less and less children. At the end of the day, there's a saying in Brazil: Brazil is the country of the future and will always be the country of the future. Overall, Latin America has been largely ignored in the study of demographics outside of its unique ethnic, linguistic, and racial structure. And there really needs to be more studies done and more attention paid to this region to better understand the demographic trends. And I'm very open to changing my mind in accordance to the evidence. Now let's move on to the other side of the Atlantic. Let's get to Europe. Europe has been facing numerous demographic crises, as major European countries have stagnant or even declining population metrics for a number of reasons. Europe is heavily urbanized, which de-incentivizes having a lot of children, since having a lot of children in a city is a liability rather than an asset. Not only is Europe post-agrarian, or post-agricultural, whatever you wish to call it, but it is also post-industrial, meaning that many people work in the service and knowledge-based economies, and oftentimes these people are less inclined to have children, and when they have children, they'll only have a few, as they're oftentimes busy working in an office. And this applies to both men and women. On top of that, much of Europe is also very secular. Less religious people, and especially people who don't identify with any religion at all, tend to be less likely to produce a lot of babies. As stated before, the Lord said, "Be fruitful and multiply." There have been many attempts to mitigate this issue. Many European nations have very strong social safety nets, and some of them have provided services like universal childcare for pre-K children, as well as tax incentives for pumping out more babies. Another more controversial issue has been mitigating the crisis with immigration. Part of the reason why European countries aren't declining in terms of their population, at least in terms of many Western European countries, is by and large because of this immigration. A disproportionate number of these immigrants come from the Middle East and North Africa, who by and large are Muslim. This has resulted in a significant cultural clash between native, secular, historically Christian white Europeans and the more conservative, highly religious Middle Eastern populations that by and large make up considerable minorities of many Western European nations. Some countries in Eastern Europe, however, have been far more hostile to immigration, and for better or for worse, this has led to declining populations, but less of the culture clash. I've noticed that the former communist countries tend to have particularly low birth rates. It's difficult to decipher whether this was a critical factor behind their declining populations. However, I would argue that the lack of immigration and by and large more pessimism in their overall political systems and less opportunities in Eastern Europe than Western Europe has resulted in some degree of degrowth in some nations. This is also true for the Russian Federation, which also has declining birth rates. It was one of the hardest hit by the demographic crisis. Not only is the country embroiled in an unprovoked war that has led to the demise of a large segment of its young male population, as well as a large segment of the young male population that has fled the country to avoid the draft, but on top of that, there's also a relative lack of interest from the international community of immigrants to go to the country. On top of that, there's a deep sense of pessimism, a lack of a meta-narrative to tie the country together. By and large, this doesn't prompt couples to pump out babies. In response to this, the Kremlin has promoted pro-natalist policies that by and large appeal less to economic incentives, but more to cultural values, promoting tradition and Eastern Orthodox Christian beliefs that were once persecuted under communist times. This hasn't exactly worked out well, at least not yet. Now let's move on to a very different set of demographic factors in a very different region. Let's move on to the Middle East, because most people in the comments section will get pissed off anyway. But thankfully, my channel is so small that there'll barely be any comments to begin with. The Middle East, with very few exceptions, has very high birth rates. Overall, the populations are very religious, and as stated before, religious people tend to produce more babies. On top of that, many of these countries, with a handful of exceptions, tend to be pretty low on economic development, and a lot of these countries have severe women's rights issues that oftentimes limit the number of opportunities women can get when it comes to education and a career, and this oftentimes results in them having a lot of children. This is probably the main reason why Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. With that being said, there are some exceptions, namely in Western Gulf nations. But then again, there are exceptions to the exceptions because Saudi Arabia has one of the youngest populations on the planet despite being very wealthy. Overall, when you look at many of the Gulf states, much of their population is composed of expats. In the UAE, it's actually over 80%. On top of that, the native populations of these Gulf states have strong social safety nets, and the countries have political stability and a great deal of prosperity. On the other hand, there are far more women getting more and more education in some of these wealthy Gulf states, and they by and large have post-industrial economies. I wouldn't be surprised if the size of families eventually shrinks in the coming decades. Now let's move on to Israel. Now, Israel is kind of the exception to Western nations. It has some of the highest birth rates in the developed world. And this has been seen most significantly from religious Jews, but also secular Jews who have pretty high birth rates by the standards of secular people. Israel will be eventually at an important crossroads as its population has one of the highest birth rates among the only Jewish state, but its occupation of the West Bank has proved to be quite controversial, in part due to the large birth rates among Arabs in the occupied territories. This will create a great deal of political instability down the line unless there's some sort of 2 or 3 state solution being prepared in the midst. So, in order to avoid the comment section being a shit show, I'm going to move on to Sub-Saharan Africa, where you see by and large the highest birth rates, with Niger having the highest birth rate of all, with the average woman having 7 children. This is the opposite of what you see in Europe or Japan. In this scenario, instead of having too few people to contribute to the economy, you have way too many. This is by and large due to a lack of education, lack of women's reproductive rights, lack of human rights in general, among other factors. On top of that, this problem will be compounded by poor infrastructure as well as food and water scarcity. It is very unlikely that many of these African countries will have the political, economic, and civic will to provide for their massive populations. Eventually, Africa may even take over Asia as the most populous continent. The more prosperous nations of Africa, relatively like Morocco or South Africa, do have relatively low birth rates, while the poorest ones, like Congo or Angola, have the highest birth rates. Many of these economies are based off of subsistence agriculture, in a system of farming where people produce their own food in order to support themselves. This is very localized. This is vastly different than, say, commercial agriculture, in which the farmers produce vast sums of food to sell to other people. When you're producing your own food, it incentivizes you to have as many children as possible to work the fields and milk the cattle. However, in a commercialized agrarian economy, this is not the case, as you just hire workers to do nearly everything. This issue will probably result in a significant catastrophe across much of the African continent. Moving eastward to another region that has very high population growth, but perhaps not as high as Africa, and that is the Indian subcontinent. This is a more complex affair. You don't see the same set of rising population rates that you do in East Africa, but at the same time, they're still growing. This is the one part of the world I can't really come up with any concrete conclusion, because on one hand, a country like India has a very large young population that contributes to a massive economy. India can certainly become an economic powerhouse, or even more of an economic powerhouse. But on the other hand, the country has rampant corruption and very poor infrastructure, and in particular, very poor sanitation, which leads to people shitting on the streets. This may lead to a massive exodus, whereby the best and brightest Indians, Pakistanis, and Bengalis eventually migrate to countries with lower population growth rates, as we've already seen. But at the end of the day, it's really hard to decipher any sort of concrete conclusion, and I'm open to more information. So I'm gonna move on to East Asia. Let's start off with China. China at one point had the largest population, but today it's debatable. India has kind of surpassed them. Their growth rate is actually not a growth rate anymore, but is actually in decline. And by and large, the population of China overall is set to decline. This is in large part due to China's former one-child policy, which later became a two-child policy and then a three-child policy. This has resulted not only in a demographic crisis in regards to age, but also in one in regards to gender dynamics, as Chinese cultural practices by and large favor sons over daughters due to a son's duty to provide for their parents as they enter their twilight years. This has led to way more men than women, and this off-balance gender dynamic has resulted in a great difficulty for many Chinese men finding wives. This could possibly result in some sort of political instability, or perhaps Chinese men will flee to countries like Russia, which have the reverse gender problem, whereby there are more women than men, in large part due to the higher rates of deaths of despair of the male population of Russia. Perhaps someone should set up a dating service to hook up Russian women with Chinese men. Anyway, China has gotten wealthy and urbanized at a very rapid pace. Prosperity and urbanization, by and large, contribute to lower population growth. Now, it's worth pointing out that much of the female population is still well integrated into the economy, and as a result, many of them are having less children as they're more educated. As far as the minority populations are concerned, well, it gets rather depressing. Just look at the Uyghur demographics. Nonetheless, China's population growth or degrowth problem pales in comparison to some of its neighbors, namely Japan and South Korea, which have some of the lowest birth rates in the world and some of the most rapidly aging populations in the world. These are highly urbanized nations for the most part, irreligious, and highly developed. This has led to some of the countries being some of the most successful on the planet. On the other hand, their very strong work ethic and terrible work-life balance does not really provide much of an opportunity for raising children. On top of that, this is mixed up with traditional Confucian gender roles, at least in South Korea, which make it very difficult for a woman to produce a family or be wives and mothers while at the same time contributing to the economy directly through a career. Keep in mind that these two nations are some of the most technologically advanced on the planet, and they also have a tradition of great respect for their elders interwoven into their cultures. So, it could be likely that they would be the first ones to innovate technology in order to compensate for a lack of a population of people in their 20s to their 60s. This may help large swaths of the population that is very elderly through the use of automation. They might also consider bringing in immigrants, but these two countries tend to be some of the most homogeneous and by and large have high levels of xenophobia. Let's move southward to Southeast Asia, and you'll get more developing countries here. This is a similar trend to what you see in Latin America, where the population rates are rising, but not to the significant enough degree like Sub-Saharan Africa where it could be catastrophic. Overall, I would need to see more information because the amount of studies done on this part of the world in relation to their demography has been quite limited. Nonetheless, it looks fairly positive and expect Vietnam and Indonesia to become economic powerhouses. Speaking of economic powerhouses, let's move on to Australia and New Zealand. Here you see similar trends to North America. These are Western, post-industrial, secular nations that attract a lot of immigrants due to their very large proportion of their population that is foreign-born. This trend will most likely continue, and by and large, due to the fact that these countries have very good infrastructure and very stable institutions, will be able to deal with steadily rising populations. It also helps that Australia is one of the most sparsely populated nations on the planet, and by and large this will result in, well, positive results. And that's my summary of the demographics of the world. Obviously I'm only scratching the surface, but if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, or maybe a thumbs down if you're an asshole. And maybe I'll consider doing a deep dive into one of these regions. Thanks for watching, and enjoy the science of life and death.